The bullet that ended Sheriff Amos Dobbs's 20 years of easy peace in Willow Creek, Kansas, came not from an outlaw's pistol, but from a startled roan gelding that threw him hard against a hitching post on the morning of the 14th of June, 1887, and cracked the bone in his left leg clean through. And it was that broken bone, more than anything else, that put a tin star on the chest of a drifting cowboy named Henry Carson, and set loose a truth that had been buried in Kansas dirt for 2 decades. Henry had ridden into Willow Creek only the evening before, dust-caked and saddle-sore from 3 weeks pushing a small herd up from the Cimarron country for a rancher who had, in the end, decided he did not much care for Henry's asking wage. And so Henry found himself with a little pay, a tired horse, and no particular place to be, which was, if he was honest with himself, the condition he had lived in for most of the 8 years since he had ridden home from Texas Ranger service, to find that home no longer had much use for him. He was 29 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of rope and saddle, with sun-lined skin and a quiet way of looking at a man that made most people decide rather quickly whether they trusted him or did not, and those who trusted him rarely had cause to regret it. He had taken a room above the Prairie Rose boarding house, run by a sharp-tongued, kind-eyed widow named Louisa Whittaker, and it was there, at the boarding-house table over a breakfast of biscuits and salt pork, that he first laid eyes on Mabel Whittaker, and though he did not know it yet, that breakfast was the last ordinary morning either of them would have for a long while. She came down the stairs with ink stains on her fingers and a folded broadsheet under her arm, moving with the brisk purpose of a woman who had somewhere to be and little patience for men who lingered in her way. And when she nearly collided with Henry in the doorway, she looked up at him with sharp gray eyes that seemed to measure him in an instant and find him provisionally acceptable. "You are the cowboy," she said, not quite a question. "I am a cowboy," Henry allowed, tipping his hat. "Whether I'm the one you mean, I couldn't say. Aunt Louisa mentioned there was a stranger taking the East Room. I run the Willow Creek Herald. I like to know who is in my town before they cause trouble in it." She said this without malice, more the way a bookkeeper might announce a column of figures, and Henry found himself smiling before he had decided to. "I don't plan on causing any trouble, ma'am. I mean to sell my horse's strength to whoever needs driving done, collect my wage, and move along toward Dodge City inside the week." "That is what every stranger says," Mabel replied, "right up until the moment they do not move along at all." And with that she swept past him and out into the street, leaving Henry standing in the doorway with his hat still in his hand, and an odd, unfamiliar curiosity settling into his chest, the kind he had not felt in a long time about anything other than a fair price for cattle. He did not know, that morning, that Mabel Whittaker carried a wound of her own, an old one, invisible as a scar beneath a sleeve, and that it had shaped every sharp word and guarded glance she gave to strangers since she was a small child too young to remember her own mother's face. The trouble that changed the shape of the day began less than 2 hours later, when a boy came running down Main Street shouting that the sheriff's horse had bolted and thrown him. And by the time Henry reached the little clapboard office with its barred window and its faded shingle reading Willow Creek Sheriff, a crowd of townsfolk had already gathered, and Doc Prout was kneeling beside Amos Dobbs in the dust, setting the leg with a grim efficiency born of long practice on a frontier where broken bones were common as broken promises. 6 weeks, Doc Prout said, wiping his hands on a rag, maybe 8 before he walks without a crutch, and he will not be sitting a horse or standing a watch for any of it. Amos Dobbs, a heavy-set man of 58 with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen 20 years of frontier justice, groaned through gritted teeth. "Rourke's gone to Ellsworth with the Talbot boy for his hearing, won't be back till week's end. Marshal Pike ain't due through on the evening train till near dark. That leaves this town with no law at all for near a full day, and the Prout boys were seen not 4 miles out just yesterday looking mean as sin. The town council, such as it was, gathered hastily in front of the mercantile. A cluster of anxious men in dark coats, chief among them a tall silver-haired gentleman with a gold watch chain and a voice smooth as poured cream, who introduced himself to Henry as Cyrus Vance, president of the Vance Trust and Cattle Bank, and by unspoken agreement of the town, its foremost citizen. "We cannot leave Willow Creek without a badge, even for a single day," Vance said, surveying the crowd with the easy authority of a man accustomed to being listened to. "Who among you has law experience?" It was Mabel who spoke first, stepping forward from the edge of the crowd with her notebook still clutched in her hand. "Mr. Carson here rode with the Texas Rangers. He told my aunt so at breakfast this very morning." Henry shot her a look, half surprise and half something like gratitude, though he was not sure yet whether to be grateful, and Amos Dobbs, from where he lay propped against the boardwalk with his leg splinted, fixed Henry with a measuring stare not unlike the one Mabel had given him not 2 hours before. "That true, son?" "4 years," Henry admitted. "Along the Nooses Strip before that. I ain't looking for the job, Sheriff. I was fixing to be gone from here by Sunday." "I ain't offering you a job," Dobbs said. "I'm asking you to hold this town together for one day, till Marshal Pike gets off that evening train and can appoint somebody proper, or till Rourke gets back, whichever comes first. One day, Mr. Carson. Come sundown, you can hand that star right back to me and ride on to Dodge City with my thanks and a meal on the town's account." There was a long moment where Henry looked from the old sheriff's pained, hopeful face to the ring of anxious townsfolk, to Cyrus Vance's smooth, appraising smile, and finally to Mabel Whittaker, who was watching him with an expression he could not quite read, something between challenge and hope, and he found himself thinking that a man who had spent 8 years drifting from one temporary thing to another might, for one single day, try being something else. "One day," Henry said, and Amos Dobbs, wincing, reached up and pressed the tin star into his palm. He pinned it to his shirt with hands that had not held such a thing in 8 years, and the weight of it, though it was only tin and a bit of thread, felt like something considerably heavier settling onto his chest. The first hours of Henry's single day as sheriff of Willow Creek passed in ordinary business, the sort any lawman might expect, checking that the jail's one occupant, a drunk cowhand sleeping off a bottle of bad whiskey, was still breathing, walking the length of Main Street to be seen, and to let the town know its law had not entirely vanished, and fielding the curious stares of townsfolk who eyed the star on his chest as though it might fall off if they looked at it too hard. It was nearing noon, with the Kansas sun beating hard and white on the packed dirt street, when Mabel Whittaker found him again, this time not by accident. "I need to speak with you," she said, and there was something different in her voice now, a tightness that had not been there at breakfast. "Speak away, Miss Whittaker." "Not here." She glanced up and down the street, and Henry, following the direction of her eyes, saw Cyrus Vance standing on the steps of his bank in conversation with 2 other men, watching the street with the mild interest of a man surveying his own property. "Walk with me to the newspaper office. There is something you should see, and something I should tell you, and it concerns why I put your name forward this morning when I might just as easily have kept quiet and let the council fret." They walked together past the mercantile and the harness shop to a narrow storefront with Willow Creek Herald painted in fading gold letters above the door, and inside, amid the smell of ink and paper and the low ticking of a small clock on the wall, Mabel drew out a wooden box from beneath the composing table, old and scarred, its brass hinges gone green with age. "My father built this box," she said. "Thomas Whittaker. He was the town's blacksmith, back when Willow Creek was hardly more than a crossing and a trading post. In 1867, when I was less than a year old, my mother, Sarah Whittaker, was found dead in the willows along the creek that gives this town its name. Someone had struck her down and left her there, and though no one ever proved it, the whole town decided my father had done it, because a knife with his mark on the handle was found near her body, and because a marriage gone sour is easier for folks to believe than a stranger's cruelty. Henry said nothing, only listened, and Mabel's voice, though steady, carried the particular flatness of a person who has told a painful story so many times in her own head that the words have worn smooth as river stones. He was never arrested, for there was no proof beyond the knife, which he swore he had lost weeks before. But a man does not need to be arrested to be convicted in a town's eyes, Mr. Carson. They would not sell him feed for his forge. They would not bring their horses to be shod. My Aunt Louisa took me in, for my father could no longer feed us both and work, and in 1869 he left Willow Creek for good, and he died in Abilene 4 years later of a fever, alone, still under the shadow of a crime I do not believe he committed. You don't believe it, Henry said quietly, or you know it. Mabel's chin lifted, and for the first time that day, something like tears stood bright in her sharp gray eyes before she blinked them fiercely away. I have spent 9 years going through every paper in this office and every ledger my aunt kept, trying to find some thread that might lead somewhere other than my father's grave. I have found nothing. Sheriff Dobbs was a young deputy then, and he always believed my father innocent too, but belief is not evidence, and evidence is what the law requires. Why tell me this now? Because, Mabel said, and here her voice caught just slightly, an hour ago, a boy came to my door. Old Jeb Calloway is dying out at his shack past the Sanderson place, and he has been asking in his fever for whoever is wearing the sheriff's star. He says he has something he must confess before he goes, something about my mother. And I could not, in good conscience, let Amos Dobbs lie broken in his bed and Sam Rourke ride off to Ellsworth, and this town go a single day without someone wearing that star who might actually listen, Mr. Carson, rather than simply keep the peace until sundown. I put your name forward because I looked at you this morning, and I thought, here is a man who has seen enough of the world to know that some truths are worth chasing even when they are inconvenient. Henry stood there in the ink-smelling quiet of the newspaper office, the tin star strange and heavy on his chest, and felt the plain, uncomplicated shape of the day he had agreed to shift into something far more complicated and far more important than minding a jail and walking a street. Then we had best not waste what daylight we have, he said. Get your bonnet, Miss Whittaker. You know the way to Calloway's place better than I do. They rode double for the first mile, Mabel behind Henry on his tired but willing gelding, her hands light at his waist and her bonnet ribbons snapping in the dry Kansas wind, until they reached the livery and Henry rented a second horse for her from old Mr. Sanderson, who asked no questions when he saw the star on Henry's shirt, only nodded and waved them on with the particular deference frontier men gave to any badge, however new-pinned it might be. The ride out to Jeb Calloway's shack took the better part of 40 minutes, across rolling grassland gone gold and green under the June sun, past a scattering of grazing cattle bearing the Vance brand, and Henry used the time to ask Mabel the questions a lawman ought to ask, though he found himself just as eager to know the answers as a man simply curious about the woman riding beside him. Who was Jeb Calloway to your mother, or to your father? He worked cattle for Cyrus Vance back then, same as he does still, though he is too old and too sick now to do much beyond tend the calving pens. I do not know that he had any particular connection to my parents. That is what troubles me most, Mr. Carson. If he knows something, it means he has carried it silently for 20 years while my father died in disgrace 4 counties away. Men carry silence for all kinds of reasons, Henry said. Fear is the most common one I ever saw. A man afraid for his own hide or for someone he loves will swallow a truth for a lifetime rather than risk what speaking it might cost him. Fear of whom, though? My father is long dead. There is no one left in Willow Creek who would suffer for the truth coming out, save perhaps my own family's good name, and that has suffered plenty already. Henry did not answer that, for he did not yet have an answer, but a small cold suspicion had begun to form at the back of his mind, the kind a man learns to trust after years of reading trouble in a room before it ever shows its face, and he found his eyes drifting, without quite meaning to, toward the cattle wearing the Vance brand grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. Jeb Calloway's shack stood alone at the edge of a dry gully, a low structure of weathered gray boards with a linta for a mule that had long since wandered off or been sold. And when Henry and Mabel dismounted and approached, they were met at the door by a boy of perhaps 12, Jeb's grandson, whose eyes were red-rimmed with worry. "He's been asking for the sheriff since morning," the boy said. "Doc Prout was out here at dawn, says his lungs are near gone, says he might not see tonight." Inside, the shack was dim and close with the smell of sickness, and Jeb Calloway lay on a narrow cot beneath a threadbare quilt, a shrunken, white-whiskered man whose chest rose and fell with a terrible rattling effort, but whose eyes, when they found the tin star on Henry's chest, went sharp and urgent with a clarity that seemed to cost him great effort to hold onto. "You're the new sheriff," Jeb wheezed. "Where's Dobbs?" "Broke his leg this morning," Henry said, kneeling beside the cot. "I'm minding the town till the county marshal comes through tonight. Name's Henry Carson." "Don't matter who you are," Jeb said, "long as you got that star and long as you'll listen." His eyes shifted to Mabel, standing just behind Henry with her hands clenched white-knuckled in her skirt, and something like grief moved across his ravaged face. "Lord, girl, you've got your mother's eyes. I ain't looked at you close in years. I couldn't bear to." "Mr. Calloway," Mabel said, her voice trembling despite her evident effort to hold it steady, "please. Whatever you know about my mother, I am begging you to tell it now." Jeb Calloway closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again there were tears standing in the deep creases of his face, and he began to speak in a slow, halting voice, pausing often to fight for breath, while Henry drew a small notebook and pencil from his coat, a habit left over from Ranger days, and began to write down every word. "20 years back," Jeb said, "I was young, not much past 20 myself, working cattle for Cyrus Vance, same as I do to this day, though he's a bank man now more than a cattleman. Vance was courting your mother before she ever married Thomas Whitaker, girl. Courting her hard, and she turned him down for the blacksmith instead, and Vance never did take kindly to being turned down for anything in his life." Mabel had gone very still, and Henry laid a steadying hand briefly on her shoulder without quite thinking about the gesture, only knowing she needed something solid to hold on to. "The evening your mother died," Jeb went on, "Vance sent me out to the north pasture on some fool errand about a fence post, kept me out there past dark for no good reason I could ever figure, except that I come to understand later he wanted no witness near the house. When I come back in near midnight, I saw Vance himself down by the creek, washing his hands and his shirt cuffs in the water, and there was blood on that shirt, Sheriff. I saw it plain as I see you now, even in the dark, for the moon was near full that night. I didn't think nothing of it right then, thought maybe he'd cut himself skinning a rabbit or some such. It weren't till the next morning, when they found your mother dead in them very willows, not 30 yards from where I'd seen him washing, that I understood what I'd seen." "Why did you not speak?" Mabel's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because," Jeb said, and his whole body seemed to shudder with the shame of the confession, "Vance come to me 2 days later, before your father was even properly accused, and he told me, plain as anything, that my little sister's homestead claim, the one she and her husband had worked 3 years to prove up, sat on land he held the note for, and that if I ever spoke one word about what I'd seen, he would foreclose that note before the week was out and see my sister and her babies thrown out onto the prairie with nothing. I was a coward, girl. I let your father hang in the town's eyes so my sister could keep her roof. I have lived 20 years with that weight, and I mean to die without it if you and this sheriff will let me." The shack was silent save for the terrible rattle of Jeb's breathing and the soft scratch of Henry's pencil finishing its notes, and Mabel had sunk down onto a rough stool beside the cot, her face pale as milk, one hand pressed hard against her mouth. "There's more," Jeb said. "There's the knife. Vance planted it, girl. I seen him do it, though I didn't understand what I was seeing at the time, not till years after. He had one of Thomas Whitaker's knives, one he'd bought or traded off him honest enough some months before, and he left it there by the creek for whoever found your mother to find. I only pieced that together later, turning it over in my mind through long sleepless nights, but I am as certain of it now as I am certain I am dying in this bed." Henry looked up from his notes. "Mr. Calloway, will you put your name to this? Sign a statement before witnesses so that it stands as testimony even after you're gone." "I'll sign it," Jeb said, "and gladly if this cough don't take the pen clean out of my hand first." It took the better part of an hour, with Henry writing out the statement in plain, careful language, while Jeb corrected small details and Mabel sat holding the old man's trembling hand. But at last it was done. A full page of testimony describing what Jeb Calloway had seen and heard 20 years before, and Jeb signed it in a shaking scrawl, and his grandson signed beneath as one witness, and Henry signed as the acting sheriff of Willow Creek, and Mabel signed last of all. Her hand steadier than Henry would have expected, though her eyes were wet. "Thank you," she said to the dying man, and she pressed his hand between both of hers. "Thank you for telling the truth even at the end." "Wished I'd told it 20 years sooner," Jeb whispered. "Might have saved your father his life and you your girlhood. That's the sin I carry heaviest, girl, not the silence itself but all the years it cost you. Forgive an old coward if you can find it in you." "I forgive you," Mabel said, and Henry, watching her say it, felt something turn over in his chest that had nothing to do with the case at all. Only the sight of a woman finding the grace to forgive a wrong that had shaped her whole life, and finding it not out of weakness but out of a strength he suspected she did not fully know she possessed. Jeb Calloway closed his eyes not long after, his breathing growing shallower, and though he did not die in that hour, Doc Prout, summoned by the grandson on a borrowed horse, would tell them later that evening that the old man had slipped away peacefully near dusk, his conscience unburdened at last. And there was a mercy in that, Henry thought, even amid all the trouble the confession was about to unleash upon the town. They rode back toward Willow Creek in the slanting light of early afternoon, the signed statement folded carefully inside Henry's coat, and for a long while neither of them spoke, the enormity of what they had just heard settling over both like a held breath. "He is the richest man in this town," Mabel finally said. "He sits on the school board. He loaned the money that built half the buildings on Main Street. No one will believe an old dying cowhand's word against Cyrus Vance's, not without more than a signature on a page. They'll believe a signed and witnessed confession, taken by a sworn deputy of the law, especially once the county marshal is here to see it done proper," Henry said. "And there may be more evidence yet to find. 20 years is a long time, but men like Vance get comfortable in their innocence when no one has challenged it. Comfortable men make mistakes. They keep things they shouldn't. We'll want to search wherever we can search, before he has any notion we're looking." "You mean to go up against Cyrus Vance," Mabel said, "on the strength of one day's badge?" "I mean to do what's right with whatever hours of that badge I've got left," Henry said. "Sheriff Dobbs asked me to hold this town together till sundown. Seems to me holding it together means seeing that a wrong done 20 years back doesn't stand any longer than it has to." Mabel looked at him for a long moment, the wind stirring loose strands of dark hair against her cheek, and something in her guarded expression softened, just slightly, into something warmer. "My father used to say that the measure of a man was not what he did when everyone was watching, but what he did when he could have simply ridden on and no one would have blamed him for it. You could ride on tomorrow, Mr. Carson, whatever happens today. This is not your town and this is not your grief." "Maybe not," Henry said, "but I find I don't much care to ride away from a wrong I know how to right, whether it's my town or not. And Miss Whitaker, if I'm honest, I find I don't much care to ride away from you either, though I've known you scarcely half a day." The words surprised him even as he said them, plain and unguarded in a way he was not accustomed to being with anyone, and Mabel's cheeks colored, though she did not look away. "That is a bold thing to say to a woman you met at breakfast," she said, but there was no sting in it, only a kind of wondering softness. "I've found," Henry said, "that a day can hold more than most men expect. Seems only fair I should say what I'm finding in it, plain, rather than let it go unsaid and ride on regretting it." They said little else on the ride back, but something had shifted between them, some careful, tender thing beginning to take root, and when they reached the outskirts of Willow Creek, the golden afternoon light seemed, to both of them, a shade more beautiful than it had any right to be given the grim work still ahead. They did not go directly to the sheriff's office, but first to Amos Dobbs's small house on Elm Street, where the old sheriff lay propped up in bed with his splinted leg elevated on a pillow, cross and restless at his confinement. But his face went slack with shock as Henry read Jeb Calloway's confession aloud in its entirety. "Lord above," Dobbs breathed when Henry finished. "I always knew in my gut that Thomas Whitaker never did it. Man wept like a child when they found her, wept for hours. I remember it plain as anything, and a guilty man don't weep like that, not in my experience. But Vance," he shook his head slowly, "Vance funds half this county's improvements. Vance sits with the judge at supper when the circuit court comes through. This is going to be a fight, Mr. Carson, and you've got maybe 5 hours of daylight and 1 tin star to fight it with." "Then we'd best use the 5 hours well," Henry said. "Sheriff, is there anything in your old files, anything from '67 that might back this up, even a small thing?" Dobbs thought hard, his brow furrowed with the effort of reaching back 2 decades. "There's the old ledger. County kept records of every claim and note the bank held, back before Vance built his own vault. If Jeb's sister's homestead claim shows a note held by Vance around that time, foreclosed or not, that's a thread that ties to his story, even if it don't prove murder outright. Bottom drawer of my desk, locked, keys on my ring there on the dresser." Mabel found the key and the two of them hurried to the sheriff's office, where in the bottom drawer, beneath a layer of dust and old wanted notices, they found a slim ledger bound in cracked leather, and turning its brittle pages by lamplight, for the office had grown dim with the drawn shutters, Henry found an entry from the spring of 1867 in a clerk's careful hand. "Note held against the homestead claim of one Elizabeth Calloway Dunmore, sister of Jeb Calloway, lender C. Vance. Note satisfied without foreclosure. June 1867. No explanation given for the sudden satisfaction of a note that, by every other entry in the ledger, Vance had never once forgiven so easily for any other debtor." "There," Henry said quietly, "a man does not forgive a debt for nothing, not a man like Vance. That's the very month Jeb says he was bought into silence. It fits." Mabel looked up from the ledger, her gray eyes bright with something between grief and fierce vindication. "It is not proof enough to hang a man, but it is enough, I think, to make even the most skeptical judge listen." "It's enough for now," Henry agreed. "Enough to bring him in for questioning, formal and proper, before witnesses, and let the truth do the rest of its own work." It was as they were leaving the sheriff's office, the ledger and Jeb's signed confession both tucked safely inside Henry's coat, that they found their path blocked on the boardwalk by Cyrus Vance himself, immaculate in his dark coat despite the day's heat, his smooth face wearing an expression of pleasant concern that did not, Henry noticed, quite reach his eyes. "Sheriff Carson," Vance said, and there was the faintest emphasis on the title, as though reminding Henry of its temporary, borrowed nature. "I heard you rode out to see old Jeb Calloway. Sorry business, a man dying alone out there. I understand Doc Prout does not expect him to see mourning." "He didn't die alone," Henry said evenly. "Miss Whitaker and I were with him. He had some things he wanted to say before he went, and we wrote them down proper." Something flickered across Vance's face then, quick as a shadow crossing water, gone almost before Henry could be certain he had seen it. "Dying men say all manner of things, Sheriff. Fever talk. I would not put much weight on it were I in your boots." "Funny thing," Henry said. "He wasn't feverish when he spoke. Clear-headed as any man I've talked to today." And what he said matched up mighty neat with an old ledger entry Sheriff Dobbs had locked in his desk, about a note on a homestead claim, satisfied without foreclosure back in the spring of '67. The pleasant concern on Vance's face went very still, and for just a moment Henry saw, beneath the smooth banker's mask, something colder and older, a man who had spent 20 years believing himself safely buried beneath respectability and money, suddenly feeling the ground shift beneath his polished boots. "I do not know what you imagine you have found, Mr. Carson," Vance said, his voice still even but with a new hardness threading through it. "But I would think carefully before you go repeating a dying cowhand's ramblings as though they were sworn fact. I have friends on the county bench. I have friends who print newspapers in 3 counties. A man wearing a badge for one single day would do well to remember how quickly that badge can be taken away, and how much harder a man's life can become without powerful friends to smooth his path." "Is that a threat, Mr. Vance?" Mabel asked, stepping forward, her chin lifted, her voice carrying clear and steady down the boardwalk so that several passers-by turned to look. "It is a friendly caution, Miss Whittaker," Vance said, though his eyes when they moved to her held none of the warmth his words claimed. "Your father's business is long settled and long buried. I would think you, of all people, would not care to dig up old griefs that can only bring you more pain." "My father's business," Mabel said, and her voice shook now, not with fear but with a rising, righteous anger 20 years in the making, "was never settled. It was buried, Mr. Vance, by men too comfortable and too cowardly to look at the truth. I intend to see it dug up, whatever the cost to my own peace, because my father does not have 20 more years to wait for justice, and neither, I think, do I." For a long moment the 3 of them stood there on the boardwalk in the hot afternoon light, and Henry saw Vance's eyes go from Mabel to the star on Henry's chest and back again, calculating, weighing, and he understood in that moment that the smooth banker was deciding, right there in front of them, just how far he was willing to go to keep his 20-year-old secret buried. "I have business at the bank," Vance said finally, his voice recovering its smooth, unbothered tone, though his jaw was tight. "Good day to you both." And he turned and walked away down the boardwalk with the unhurried gait of a man who wished very much to appear unworried. "He's going to run," Henry said quietly, once Vance was out of earshot. "Or he's going to try to silence whatever he thinks might still talk. We need to get back to Jeb's place, make certain no harm comes to that statement or the boy who witnessed it, and we need to send word to the depot to hold that evening train, or at least to have Marshal Pike met the moment he steps off it." "I'll send the boy from the livery to the depot with a message," Mabel said, "and Mr. Carson, I think we ought not leave that signed confession out of your possession for even a moment from here on. If anything should happen to it, nothing is going to happen to it," Henry said, and he meant it as reassurance to her, though even as he said it a cold unease was settling low in his stomach, the old instinct that had kept him alive through ranger days along the nooses, the sense that trouble was gathering itself just out of sight. They did not have long to wait for it to show its face. It was Louisa Whittaker who came running down Main Street not 20 minutes later, her apron still tied about her waist, calling Mabel's name with real fear in her voice, and when she reached them she was breathless and shaking. "2 men," she gasped, rough-looking men, rode out toward the Calloway place not 10 minutes past, at a hard gallop, and Mrs. Sanderson said one of them stopped at the bank first and spoke with Mr. Vance before they rode. Henry did not wait to hear more. He was already moving toward the livery at a run, and Mabel, gathering her skirts, ran after him. "You cannot go alone," she said. "You'll need a witness to whatever you find out there, someone the town will trust when the telling of it matters, and I already know the way." Henry wanted to argue, wanted to tell her the road ahead might hold real danger, and that he would not forgive himself if harm came to her. But there was a fierce, unyielding set to her jaw that told him arguing would cost more time than it was worth. And so he simply nodded, and they mounted the same 2 horses they had ridden that afternoon and rode hard out of town, the sun now beginning its long slide toward the western horizon. They found the 2 riders' tracks easy enough in the dry June dust, a straight hard line toward the Calloway shack, and Henry pushed his gelding as fast as he dared over the uneven prairie ground, Mabel close behind him, until they crested the last low rise above the gully and saw, with a rush of relief that nearly undid Henry entirely, that the shack still stood peaceful and undisturbed in the late afternoon light, with Jeb's grandson sitting on the step, whittling a stick with a pocket knife, entirely unharmed. But even as Henry reined up and swung down from his horse, he heard the sound of hooves approaching fast from the north side of the gully, and he turned to see two riders coming on hard. One of them, a lean, hard-faced man Henry did not recognize, the other broader, with a scarred cheek, both of them with rifles slung across their saddles in a way that told Henry plainly these were not men who had ridden out for a friendly visit. "Sheriff," the boy called out, alarmed, scrambling up from the step. "Them's the same two that come by not an hour back, asking after Grandpa, asking had he talked to anyone. I told them he was sleeping and sent them off, but I reckon they didn't believe me." "Get inside," Henry said quietly to the boy, "and keep low." Then to Mabel in an urgent undertone, "Stay behind me, and if they're shooting, you get to the shack and bar the door, you hear me? Don't you play the hero on my account." "I hear you," Mabel said, though her eyes were wide and her hand had gone, without her seeming to notice, to grip the fabric of Henry's sleeve for just a moment before she let go. The two riders reined up some 20 yards off, and the lean one, whom Henry would later learn was called Dutch Merrick, one of Cyrus Vance's hired range hands with a reputation for being handy with a rifle and light on scruples, called out across the distance, "Sheriff Carson, is it? Heard you was minding the town for the day. Bit far from Main Street for a fellow whose whole authority runs out come sundown." "My authority's good enough right here, right now," Henry called back, standing easy but alert, his hand resting near the grip of the Colt at his hip, though he had not drawn it. "State your business, Merrick, if that's who you are." "Mr. Vance sent us to fetch Jeb Calloway's grandson in for some paid work, is all," Merrick said, though the words came too smooth and too quick to be believed by anyone who had spent as many years reading liars as Henry had. "No trouble intended." "Funny kind of paid work that needs 2 rifles to fetch a 12-year-old boy," Henry said. "I think you'd best turn those horses around and ride back to town, and tell Mr. Vance that Jeb Calloway is under my protection, and so is his grandson, and so is everything inside that shack, for as long as I'm wearing this star." There was a long, taut silence, the kind that stretches out over prairie grass with nothing but wind and the creak of saddle leather to fill it, and Henry saw the broader of the two men, the one with the scarred cheek, ease his hand toward the rifle slung at his saddle, and Henry's own hand moved, unhurried but final, to rest fully on the grip of his Colt. "I'd think hard on that," Henry said, his voice gone low and level in the particular way it had gone low and level a dozen times before along the nooses, when a man's next choice would decide whether the day ended in talk or in blood. "I've got a signed confession in my coat naming Cyrus Vance in a murder 20 years old, and I've got the county marshal arriving on tonight's train to see it delivered proper to a judge. Whatever quarrel Vance thinks he has left to settle out here, it's already too late for gunplay to fix it. You ride back now, quiet, and you tell him that. Or you don't, and we settle it here, and either way, that confession reaches the marshal tonight, because Miss Whittaker there has a copy of it back at her newspaper office already set in type, ready to print the moment I give her the word." That last was a bluff, spoken smooth and sure, for no such copy yet existed, but Henry had learned long ago that a bluff delivered with real conviction could do more work than a dozen bullets, and he watched it land, watched Dutch Merrick's eyes flick toward his partner, some silent calculation passing between them. "This ain't our fight," Merrick said finally, low mostly to his partner, though loud enough for Henry to hear. "Vance never said nothing about gunning down a lawman in broad daylight, not for this." "No," his partner agreed, lowering his hand from the rifle. "No, he surely did not." They turned their horses without another word and rode back the way they had come, and Henry stood watching them go until they had dwindled to a small dust cloud on the horizon, and only then did he let out the breath he had been holding, and only then did he turn to find Mabel standing close behind him, her face pale but her eyes fierce and bright. "You are either the bravest man I have ever met," she said, "or the most reckless, and I have not yet decided which." "Might be a fair measure of both," Henry admitted, and something in the way he said it, weary and honest all at once, made Mabel laugh, a short, startled sound that broke the tension of the moment and left them both, for just a heartbeat, simply looking at each other in the golden light with something warm and unspoken passing between them. "We should get back to town," Mabel said at last, though she did not look away from him. "If Vance sent men out here to silence Jeb's grandson, he is not going to simply give up because two hired hands lost their nerve. He'll try something else, something in town, before that train arrives." "Then we'd best beat him there," Henry said, and they mounted quickly, the boy waving after them from the shack step, and rode back toward Willow Creek as the afternoon began its slow surrender to evening. They reached town to find it stirring with an unease that had nothing to do with any outlaw gang, for word had begun to travel, the way word always traveled in a small town, in whispers between the mercantile and the harness shop and the boarding house porch, that something was afoot concerning Cyrus Vance and the old Whitaker murder. And by the time Henry and Mabel rode down Main Street, the boardwalks were lined with townsfolk watching them pass with open curiosity, and in some faces a dawning suspicion of their own, as though old doubts long suppressed were finally finding permission to surface. Amos Dobbs had sent word from his sickbed, through his wife, that the town council should gather at the church hall to hear whatever Henry had to report, for Dobbs himself could not be moved, and so it was that, as the sun sank low and orange over the western prairie, Henry Carson found himself standing at the front of a crowded room, the tin star still pinned to his dusty shirt, reading aloud Jeb Calloway's signed confession to a hall full of townsfolk who had known Cyrus Vance for 20 years as their most respected citizen, and who now sat in stunned, uneasy silence as the words unraveled that respectability thread by thread. Cyrus Vance himself stood near the back of the hall, having arrived, Henry noted, only after the reading had begun, flanked by two men Henry did not recognize, and when Henry finished reading, Vance stepped forward with the easy, practiced confidence of a man who had talked his way out of tighter corners than this. "This is outrageous," Vance said, his voice carrying smooth and commanding across the hall. "You would take the word of a dying old fool, delirious with fever, over 20 years of my service to this town. I built the schoolhouse. I financed the church roof you are all sitting under right now. I ask you, good people of Willow Creek, does that sound like the record of a murderer, or the record of a man being slandered by a drifting cowboy who wore a badge for one afternoon and a bitter young woman who has never once let go of an old family grudge?" There was a murmur through the hall, and Henry saw a few faces turn toward Mabel with something like doubt, and he felt her stiffen beside him, though she did not flinch from Vance's gaze. "I have a ledger too, Mr. Vance," Henry said, drawing the old leather-bound book from his coat and holding it up for the room to see. "Sheriff Dobbs's own records, kept locked in his own desk since before either of us was old enough to vote. It shows a note you held against Elizabeth Calloway Dunmore's homestead claim, satisfied without foreclosure in June of 1867, the very same month Sarah Whitaker died, the very same month Jeb Calloway says you bought his silence with that forgiven debt. I don't call that coincidence, and I don't believe any honest man in this hall calls it coincidence either." The murmur in the hall grew louder now, and Vance's smooth composure cracked, just slightly, a flush of real anger rising in his neck. "You cannot prove a debt forgiveness is anything more than an act of Christian charity, Carson. I have forgiven debts before. Ask anyone." "Have you forgiven any others, though, without so much as a note of explanation in 20 years of careful records?" Henry asked. "Sheriff Dobbs's ledger is thorough," Mr. Vance. Every other note in there, satisfied or foreclosed, carries some remark, some reason. This one carries nothing at all, like a man in a hurry to make a debt disappear before anyone thought to ask why. Vance's mouth worked silently for a moment, and Henry saw, in the faces around the hall, the tide beginning to turn, doubt hardening into something closer to belief. And it was then that Vance made the mistake that would end whatever chance he had of talking his way clear. "I want that confession destroyed," Vance said, his voice suddenly sharp and commanding, all pretense of calm gone, and he took a step toward Henry with his hand moving toward the inside of his coat. "I have spent 20 years building what I have in this town, and I will not see it torn down by a dying man's fever talk and a badge that expires at sundown." Henry's hand moved to his own Colt, not drawing it, only resting there ready, and he saw the small derringer that Vance had drawn from his coat waver in the banker's hand, more the gesture of a desperate man than a practiced gunman, and the whole hall gasped and drew back, chairs scraping against the floor. "Put it down, Vance," Henry said, his voice low and steady, the voice of a man who had talked frightened people out of foolish choices more times than he could count. "There's a hall full of your neighbors watching you right now. Whatever you do next, they'll carry the memory of it the rest of their lives, and so will you, however few years you've got left to remember it in. Put the gun down and let the law do what it's meant to do." For a long, terrible moment, Vance stood there with the small pistol shaking in his hand, his face a mask of 20 years' worth of guilt and fear finally breaking loose all at once. And then, with a sound that was almost a sob, he lowered the weapon, and Henry stepped forward and took it gently from his slackening fingers. "I loved her," Vance said, so quietly that only those nearest heard it, his eyes fixed somewhere far away on a summer evening 20 years gone. "I loved Sarah since we were children, and she chose the blacksmith over me, and I could not bear it. And when she came to me that night to ask me, of all things, to forgive Thomas a debt so they might marry with something to their name, and told me plain she would never love anyone but him, something in me broke, and his voice failed entirely, and he sank down onto a nearby chair, an old man suddenly, all his careful respectability stripped away, leaving only the raw shape of a crime carried silently for 20 years. The hall was utterly silent now, the whole town bearing witness to the collapse of a lie 2 decades in the building, and Mabel Whittaker stood very still beside Henry, her face pale and wet with tears she did not try to hide, tears Henry understood, not only for the confirmation of what she had always suspected, but for the sudden, overwhelming relief of finally knowing. It was into this silence that the evening train's distant whistle sounded, far off across the prairie, and within the hour Marshal Elias Pike, a lean, gray-haired man with a badge considerably more permanent than Henry's, arrived at the church hall to take Cyrus Vance into formal custody, reviewing Jeb Calloway's signed confession and the old ledger with a careful, professional eye before nodding slowly. "This'll hold up before the circuit judge," Pike said. Signed confession, witnesses, corroborating record, and a confession made in front of half the town not an hour past. "I'd say your 1 day of wearing that star, Mr. Carson, has done more good than most men manage in a full career." Vance was led away to the jail, subdued now, an old man whose face had gone gray and hollow with the weight of finally being seen, and the townsfolk of Willow Creek filed out of the church hall in a hush broken only by low, urgent murmurs. 20 years of assumptions about a dead woman and a disgraced blacksmith unraveling all at once into something that would take the whole town a long while yet to fully understand. Amos Dobbs, informed of everything by his wife within the hour, sent word that he wished to see Henry and Mabel both at his bedside before the night was out, and it was there, in the small lamplit house on Elm Street, that the old sheriff, his broken leg propped up and his face creased with a satisfaction 20 years overdue, reached out and shook Henry's hand. "You did in 1 day what I could not manage in 20 years of trying," Dobbs said. I always believed Thomas Whitaker innocent, son, but believing ain't the same as proving, and I never found the thread to pull. You pulled it. I don't know how a town thanks a man properly for that, but I mean to see it tries." "I didn't do it alone," Henry said, glancing at Mabel, who sat in the chair beside the bed with her hands folded in her lap, though her eyes, when they met Henry's, held something far warmer than the exhaustion of the long day should have allowed. "Miss Whitaker put my name forward this morning when she had no cause to trust a stranger, and she rode out to Calloway's place, and she stood her ground against Vance himself on Main Street when a lesser woman might have stayed safe at home. This truth belongs to her, at least as much as it belongs to me." "It belongs to my mother," Mabel said softly, "and to my father, wherever his grave lies in Abilene, that he might finally rest easy knowing his name is cleared, even 20 years too late for him to know it himself. And it belongs to Jeb Calloway, too, who died this evening, Doc Prout tells me, not an hour after Vance's confession reached him by way of his grandson, and who I hope died knowing he had finally set right what he had carried so long." There was a quiet in the little room then, full of grief and relief tangled together, and Amos Dobbs, watching the two of them, the tired but unmistakably tender way Henry's eyes kept finding Mabel's face, allowed himself a small, knowing smile beneath his gray mustache. "Sun's about to set, Mr. Carson," he said. "Your one day is about up. I reckon you'll be wanting that star back off your chest." Henry looked down at the tin star, worn now with the weight of everything the day had held, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he was not so eager to give it up as he had been that morning. "I reckon I might have a proposal for you first, Sheriff, if you're willing to hear it," Henry said. "I hear tell you might be needing a deputy for a while yet, seeing as your leg won't mend for near 2 months, and Sam Rourke can't carry the whole load of this town alone." Amos Dobbs's smile widened. "Son, I was hoping you'd say something along those lines, and when I do decide to hang up this star for good, which I reckon might be sooner than I'd planned, given how this leg is likely to ache in the winters from here on, I don't know that I could think of a better man to hand it to permanent." Outside, the last light of the long day was fading over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in bands of deep orange and violet, and Henry and Mabel walked together back toward the boarding house in a silence that had none of the awkwardness of strangers in it anymore, only the comfortable quiet of two people who had, in the space of a single extraordinary day, come to know each other in a way that might otherwise have taken years. 20 years, Mabel said softly, as they walked. "I have carried the shame of a crime that was never my father's, never truly ours at all, only something the town decided to believe because it was easier than looking closely at a rich man's guilt. I do not know quite how to feel now that it is finally lifted. Lighter, I think, but also strange, as though I have set down a weight I had grown so used to carrying that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it." "You'll grow used to standing without it," Henry said. "Might take a while. Grief and shame, even misplaced shame, don't vanish the moment the truth comes out. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore, Miss Whitaker, if you'll allow me to say so." Mabel stopped walking and turned to face him fully, there on the quiet street in the last violet light of evening, and her eyes searched his face with an openness she had not shown him at breakfast that morning, a lifetime ago, it seemed now. "You said this morning, out on the prairie road, that you'd found you didn't much care to ride away from me," she said. "Did you mean that, Mr. Carson, or was it only the strangeness of the day talking?" "I meant every word of it," Henry said, and he reached out slowly and took her hand in his, rough, calloused fingers closing gently around hers. "I've spent 8 years drifting from one job to the next, one town to the next, never much caring whether I stayed or went, because I never found a reason strong enough to plant myself anywhere. I believe I found that reason today, Mabel Whitaker, and I don't intend to let it ride off without me." "That is a very forward thing to say to a woman you have known for one single day," Mabel said, though her voice had gone soft and unsteady, and she made no move to pull her hand away. "Might be," Henry agreed, "but I've found this has been a day unlike any other I've lived, and I don't reckon I ought to waste what it's taught me out of some notion of properness. I'd like, if you'll allow it, to court you proper, Miss Whittaker, in whatever time it takes for you to trust that I mean to stay." Mabel Whittaker looked up at him for a long moment, the last light of the sunset catching gold in her dark hair, and then, for the first time since Henry had known her, her sharp, careful expression broke fully open into something warm and unguarded and entirely without doubt. "I think," she said, "that I would like that very much." He did not kiss her that evening, for it was, after all, only their first day, and both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that what had begun between them deserved to be built slowly and honestly, the way a house is built to last through hard winters rather than thrown up hastily to fall at the first storm. But he walked her the rest of the way to the boarding house with her hand still resting in the crook of his arm, and at the door he pressed her fingers gently once more before letting them go. And Mabel Whittaker went up to her room that night with a lightness in her chest that had nothing at all to do with the truth finally uncovered about her mother's death, and everything to do with the quiet, steady cowboy who had worn a sheriff's star for a single day, and in doing so, had somehow found his way straight into her heart. The weeks that followed brought their own quiet dramas, for a town does not absorb a truth like Cyrus Vance's confession without considerable upheaval. The circuit judge arrived within the month to hear the case, and Vance, faced with the weight of Jeb Calloway's signed testimony, the old ledger, and his own confession before half the town, offered no defense beyond a broken, rambling account of jealousy curdled into violence, and was sentenced to hang for the murder of Sarah Whittaker, a sentence carried out that autumn in the county seat, quiet and without spectacle, for even in his guilt the town found little appetite for making a show of an old man's ruin. The Vance Trust and Cattle Bank passed into new hands, honest ones, and the schoolhouse and the church roof Vance had built with guilty money remained standing, for buildings, the townsfolk decided, could not be blamed for the sins of the man who paid for their timber. Mabel Whittaker traveled that autumn, with Henry at her side, to Abilene, where after some searching they found her father's grave in a small, weed-choked corner of the town cemetery, marked only with a plain wooden cross bearing the name Thomas Whittaker and no dates, for no one in Abilene had known or cared enough to record when exactly a disgraced blacksmith from Willow Creek had died. Mabel knelt at that grave for a long while, and Henry stood a respectful distance off, hat in hand, until she finally rose and told him in a voice thick with tears but steady with resolve that she intended to have a proper stone carved and set, one that would tell the truth at last, that Thomas Whittaker had been a wrongly accused man, husband to Sarah, father to Mabel, and innocent of the crime that had haunted his final years. They arranged it with a stonecutter in Abilene before they left, and when the stone was finally set some months later, Mabel wrote a long piece for the Willow Creek Herald recounting the whole truth of the Whittaker murder from beginning to end, so that no one in the county could ever again whisper the old lie about her father without the truth standing plainly against it in cold print. Amos Dobbs's leg healed slower than Doc Pruitt had first hoped, and by the time the leaves along Willow Creek had gone gold and begun to fall, the old sheriff had decided, as he had hinted he might, that 20 years of frontier law was enough for any man, and he retired that November to a small house at the edge of town where he kept bees and told long stories to any child willing to sit still and listen, and the town council, with hardly a dissenting voice, offered the permanent star to Henry Carson, who by then had spent 5 months serving as deputy under Dobbs's convalescent guidance and had earned, in that short time, the trust of the whole town in a way that seemed to Henry himself almost miraculous, given how brief a stranger he had been when he first rode in. He accepted the star, this time not for one day but, as he told Mabel that evening on the porch of the Prairie Rose boarding house, for as many days as the town of Willow Creek would have him, and Mabel, sitting beside him with her hand resting easily now in his, told him that she thought the town would have him for a good many days indeed, and that she rather hoped to be there for every one of them. They were married the following spring, in April of 1888, in the same small church hall where Cyrus Vance's crime had finally come undone, and the whole town turned out for it, filling the pews and spilling out onto the church steps. For by then the story of how a drifting cowboy had worn a sheriff's star for a single day and solved a murder 20 years old, and won the heart of Mabel Whittaker in the doing of it, had become the sort of tale told and retold at supper tables and in the mercantile and along the bar of the town's one respectable saloon, growing a little in the telling each time, but never losing the plain, sturdy truth at its center. Louisa Whittaker cried through the entire ceremony, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she had embroidered herself for the occasion. And Amos Dobbs, leaning on a cane now but otherwise recovered, stood as best man, having grown fond of Henry in the months of working alongside him, fond enough to say, in his short and gruff toast at the wedding supper, that he could not have handpicked a better man to leave his town's law in charge of, nor a better man to see his old friend's niece finally happy after so many years of carrying a grief that was never rightfully hers to carry. Henry Carson served as sheriff of Willow Creek for the better part of the next 30 years, and in all that time the town never again saw trouble quite so deep or quite so old as the one he had unraveled in his very first day wearing the star, though there were, of course, ordinary troubles enough along the way, drunken cowhands and the occasional cattle thief and disputes over water rights that Henry, with the same patient, steady manner that had won him Mabel's trust and the town's, settled more often with careful words than with drawn guns. Mabel continued running the Willow Creek Herald for many years, and under her careful stewardship, the little paper became known throughout the county for its honesty and its refusal to let comfortable lies stand unexamined simply because the truth was harder to print. And more than one young reporter who came through Willow Creek in later years would say that Mabel Whittaker Carson had taught them more about the responsibility of telling the truth than any editor they worked for afterward. They had 3 children together in the years that followed, the first a son they named Thomas, after Mabel's father, born in the winter of 1889, a sturdy, dark-haired boy who grew up hearing the story of his grandfather's wrongful disgrace and his eventual vindication told and retold at the supper table until he could recite the whole of it himself, and who grew into a young man with his mother's sharp intelligence and his father's steady calm. 2 years after Thomas came a daughter, Sarah, named for the grandmother she never knew, a bright, curious girl who took to her mother's newspaper office from the time she could first hold a pencil steady, setting type alongside Mabel on quiet afternoons and dreaming, even as a small girl, of one day running the Herald herself. And 5 years after Sarah came a second son, Jeb, named, at Mabel's insistence, for the old cowhand whose deathbed confession had finally broken open the truth, a name that raised a few eyebrows among the town's older gossips, but which Mabel defended fiercely whenever anyone questioned it, saying that a man who found the courage to confess a 20-year silence, however late, deserved to be remembered kindly rather than only for the cowardice that had come before it. On summer evenings, when the day's work was done and the children had finally settled, Henry and Mabel would often sit together on the porch of the house they had built on the edge of town, close enough to Main Street to hear the ordinary sounds of the community they had helped heal, far enough to feel the wide, quiet peace of the prairie stretching out behind them. And Henry would sometimes take out the old tin star he had worn that first extraordinary day, kept now in a small wooden box alongside Jeb Calloway's original signed confession and the brittle old ledger page, mementos of the single day that had changed the whole shape of his life, and he would turn it over slowly in his rough, weathered hands. "One day," he would say sometimes, shaking his head with a small, wondering smile, "one day wearing this thing, and it gave me everything I ever wanted, though I didn't have the sense that morning to know I was wanting it." "It was not the star that gave you anything," Mabel would answer, leaning her head against his shoulder as the sun went down gold and orange over the endless Kansas grass. The same wide sky that had watched over her mother's death 20 years before her own happiness had finally bloomed beneath it. It was the man wearing it, Henry Carson, who chose, on a day when he might easily have ridden on and no one would have blamed him, to stay and see a hard thing through to the end. That is the man I fell in love with in a single day, and that is the man I have loved every single day since, and I expect I will go on loving him every day for however many the good Lord sees fit to give us. And there, on that quiet porch, with their children's voices drifting faintly from the house behind them, and the vast, healed piece of Willow Creek spread out before them beneath the darkening sky, Henry Carson and Mabel Whittaker Carson would sit together in the deep, contented silence of two people who had found, against every ordinary expectation of a single passing day, the whole rest of their lives.